honor, sacrifice, loyalty. These were the words etched above the doorway of the military base where Captain James Mitchell had spent the last 15 years of his life. Words that had shaped him, guided him, and sometimes in the darkest hours of night when he was thousands of miles from home, comforted him. The scorching Afghan sun beat down on James's neck as he finished his video call with Sarah, his wife of 12 years. Her smile had seemed strained today, her eyes not quite meeting the camera. He chalked it up to the stress of managing their household alone while raising their 9-year-old daughter, Emma. "I miss you," he had told her, the same words he said at the end of every call. "We miss you too," she had replied, her voice carrying across continents, satellites bouncing their connection across the vast emptiness of space, much like the emptiness he felt in his chest whenever he thought of home. James tucked his phone into his pocket and adjusted his helmet. 3 more months until his deployment ended. 3 more months until he could hold his family again. He had no idea that his world was already crumbling, pixel by pixel, through the very screen he had just put away. Captain Mitchell, Lieutenant Rodriguez called out, jogging toward him across the dusty compound. "The colonel wants to see you ASAP." James nodded, pushing thoughts of home aside. Here, focus meant survival for himself and for the men and women under his command. Whatever was happening at home would have to wait. But fate doesn't always honor our timelines, and some truths refuse to remain buried under distance and duty. As James made his way to the colonel's office, his phone buzzed with a notification. An email from an unfamiliar address with an attachment. He would have ignored it, but the subject line made his blood run cold. "Your wife isn't who you think she is." His finger hovered over the delete button. Spam. It had to be spam. But a voice in his head, the same instinct that had saved his life in combat more times than he cared to count, whispered that he needed to see what was inside. He opened the email. The attached photos loaded slowly on the base's weak internet connection, each pixel revealing a truth James wasn't prepared to face. Sarah, his Sarah, entering hotels with different men. Dates stamped over the last 2 years of his deployments. A letter from someone claiming to be a concerned neighbor, detailing times, places, patterns that couldn't be coincidence. The ground seemed to shift beneath James's feet. The desert heat suddenly felt unbearable, suffocating. How could the person who had promised to be his safe harbor become the storm that threatened to drown him? As he stood there, frozen in the Afghan sun, James didn't know that this moment would be the beginning of a journey that would test every definition of service, loyalty, and love he had ever known. James Mitchell had always been the kind of man who stood out in a crowd without trying. 6'2", with shoulders built for bearing burdens, eyes that held the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. He had joined the army straight out of high school, finding in its structure and purpose the direction he'd always craved. He met Sarah Walker during his first leave after basic training. She was working as a nurse at the VA hospital where his uncle was recovering from surgery. Their eyes had met across a crowded cafeteria, and something in her smile had felt like coming home. "You look lost, soldier," she had said, approaching his table with an extra pudding cup balanced on her tray. "Not anymore," he had replied, a rare moment of spontaneous flirtation that still made him smile when he remembered it. Their courtship had been a whirlwind 3 months of dating before his first deployment, a proposal via video call from Iraq, a wedding during his 2-week leave that had felt like trying to cram a lifetime into 14 days. Then back to war, with Sarah's scent still lingering on his uniform and her promise to wait echoing in his ears. For the first few years, the separations had been bearable. They talked every day when possible. She sent care packages filled with reminders of home, his favorite snacks, a t-shirt sprayed with her perfume, photographs of the life waiting for him. When Emma was born, James had been granted emergency leave to hold his daughter for a precious 48 hours before returning to duty. But as the years passed, something had shifted. The calls became shorter, the care packages less frequent. Sarah's letters, once filled with intimate details of her days and dreams for their future, grew vague and generic. "Just busy," she would say when he asked if everything was all right. "The hospital's short-staffed. Emma's activities take up so much time." James had believed her because he wanted to, because the alternative was too painful to consider, because trust was the foundation they had built everything upon. Now, staring at undeniable evidence of betrayal, James felt that foundation crumble. The photos showed Sarah, her face unmistakable despite the grainy quality, entering the Grand Regent Hotel downtown. Different dates, different men, some in business suits, one in medical scrubs, another in casual clothes. The timestamps corresponded perfectly with his deployments. The letter was worse than the photos. Captain Mitchell: I've debated sending this for months. I live 3 doors down from your home and have witnessed your wife's behavior for the past 2 years. As a former military spouse myself, I know the sacrifices you're making, and I believe you deserve the truth. While you're serving our country, your wife has been entertaining various men in your home, the home where your daughter sleeps. I've documented dates and times which match the photos attached. I'm sorry to be the bearer of such news, but if it were my husband overseas, I would want someone to tell me. A concerned neighbor. James read the email 3 times, searching for some alternative explanation, some way this could all be a mistake or a cruel prank, but the evidence was too specific, too detailed. He thought about Emma, his beautiful daughter with her gap-toothed smile and curious mind. What was she witnessing? What was she learning about love and commitment from watching her mother's actions? The colonel's summons forgotten, James found himself walking toward the base chapel, a plain building that offered the only true privacy on the compound. Inside, the air was cooler, the light filtering through simple stained glass, casting colored shadows on the floor. James sat in the last pew and did something he hadn't done since he was a child. He wept. Not the quiet tears of grief he had shed over fallen comrades, but gut-wrenching sobs that seemed to come from some primal place within him. When he finally regained his composure, he found Chaplain Rivera sitting silently beside him. "Want to talk about it?" son, the older man asked, his voice gentle with the wisdom of someone who had heard every kind of human suffering. James handed him his phone with the email still open. The chaplain read without comment, then returned the phone and sighed deeply. "What are you going to do?" he asked. It was the question James had been asking himself since the first photo loaded. What could he do? He was thousands of miles away, in the middle of a critical mission. His men depended on him. His country depended on him. "I don't know," James admitted. "I need to protect my daughter. I need to understand why. I need." His voice broke. "I need to not be here right now." Chaplain Rivera placed a weathered hand on James's shoulder. "The hardest battles we fight aren't always the ones with guns and tanks. Sometimes they're the ones within our own hearts." James nodded, feeling the weight of a different kind of war settling onto his shoulders, one for which his military training had never prepared him. Sarah Mitchell stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the woman looking back at her. Dark circles shadowed her once bright eyes, and strain had etched lines around her mouth that makeup couldn't quite conceal. She splashed cold water on her face, trying to wash away the guilt that had become her constant companion. The house was quiet. Emma was at school, and her latest companion, Dr. Robert Collins from the hospital, had left hours ago with promises to call that both of them knew were empty. This hadn't been the life Sarah had envisioned when she married James. She had been 23, idealistic, and deeply in love with the handsome soldier who looked at her like she was the answer to every question he'd ever had. "I can handle the deployments," she had assured him, confident in her strength. "My dad was Navy. I know what I'm signing up for." But knowing and living were different beasts. The first year had been manageable, the newness of marriage carrying her through the loneliness. The second year, harder but still bearable. By the third year, with a colicky baby and no family nearby, the isolation had begun to eat away at her resolve. It wasn't just the physical absence that wore her down. It was the emotional distance that grew with each deployment. James came home changed in ways she couldn't quite articulate, more reserved, haunted by experiences he wouldn't share, carrying burdens she couldn't help lighten. When Emma started school, Sarah returned to nursing, finding in her work the purpose and connection she craved. The hospital became her sanctuary, a place where she was valued for her skills rather than defined by her husband's absence. Dr. Mark Stenson had been the first. A divorced surgeon with kind eyes who really noticed her in a way she hadn't felt in years. "You look like you could use this more than me," he had said one night during a grueling shift, offering her the last cup of decent coffee from the doctor's lounge. Their affair had lasted 3 months before guilt forced Sarah to end it. She had sworn to herself never again. She had renewed her commitment to her marriage, arranged more video calls with James, even started planning a second honeymoon for when he returned. But then came the next deployment, and the next, and the crushing loneliness that followed each goodbye. Robert had been the fourth. Or was it the fifth? Sarah had stopped counting, stopped justifying. Each time she promised herself it would be the last. Each time the emptiness inside her grew. She hadn't meant for any of them to come to the house. That had been a desperate mistake after too many glasses of wine last month. Emma had been at a sleepover, and the thought of another night alone in the queen-sized bed that emphasized James's absence had been unbearable. Sarah picked up her phone, scrolling to James's last message. A simple "I love you" sent before his mission yesterday. Her thumb hovered over the screen. What could she possibly say in return that wasn't tainted with lies? The doorbell rang, startling her from her thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw Mrs. Gallagher from down the street, a stern-faced woman whose husband had retired from the Marines after 30 years of service. Sarah's stomach clenched. Had she seen something? Known something? The neighborhood had always been politely distant with her, the wives of career military men forming a tight circle that somehow never quite included her. Mrs. Gallagher, Sarah said, forcing a smile as she opened the door. What a surprise. I think we need to talk, Sarah, the older woman, said, her expression grave. May I come in? As Mrs. Gallagher stepped into the living room, the same room where Sarah had entertained Robert, just hours before Sarah felt a wave of shame so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. I've always believed that military families should look out for each other, Mrs. Gallagher began, declining Sarah's offer of coffee. My Thomas was deployed for more than half our marriage. I know what it's like. I appreciate that, but... Let me finish. Please, Mrs. Gallagher's voice was firm but not unkind. I've seen the men, Sarah. We all have. The world seemed to stop spinning. Sarah sank onto the couch, unable to maintain the pretense any longer. Does everyone know? She whispered. Not everyone. But enough. Mrs. Gallagher sat beside her, her posture rigid with disapproval yet somehow not without compassion. I didn't come to judge you, though God knows I've done my share of that from my kitchen window. I came because I received a call from the base chaplain an hour ago. Your husband knows. Sarah's blood ran cold. What? How? Someone sent him photos, evidence. The chaplain wouldn't say who, but he's concerned about James's state of mind. He asked me to check on you to make sure you're prepared for what's coming. The room began to spin. James knew. The thought she had pushed away for months now stood before her, unavoidable and devastating. What am I going to do? Sarah asked, more to herself than to Mrs. Gallagher. The older woman sighed. I can't answer that. But I will tell you this: whatever you've done, however far you've strayed, you have a choice now. You can continue down this path, or you can find the courage to face what you've broken and see if there's anything worth salvaging. You think I should fight for my marriage? After what I've done? Mrs. Gallagher stood, straightening her cardigan with dignified movements. I think you should fight for your self-respect first. Figure out why you've made these choices. Decide who you want to be for yourself, for your daughter, and yes, for James too, if he's willing to listen. The rest will follow. After Mrs. Gallagher left, Sarah sat motionless on the couch, staring at the family portrait hanging on the wall, James in his dress uniform, Emma on his lap, Sarah standing behind them with her hands on his shoulders. They looked happy. They had been happy once. She reached for her phone and, for the first time in years, called the one person she had been avoiding since her marriage began to crumble, her father. Daddy, she said when he answered, her voice breaking. I've made a terrible mistake. 2 weeks after receiving the email, James Mitchell stood outside his own home, key in hand, feeling like an intruder. The emergency leave had been granted with surprising speed. The colonel, upon learning the situation, had arranged everything within hours. Family comes first, Mitchell, he had said, his usual gruffness softened by understanding. Go home and sort this out. Your team will be here when you return. But the 14-hour flight had given James too much time to think, to imagine confrontations that ranged from cold fury to broken reconciliation. By the time he landed on American soil, he had rehearsed a dozen different scenarios, none of which felt right. He hadn't told Sarah he was coming. Some tactical part of his brain, the part trained to maintain the element of surprise in hostile situations, had insisted on it. Now, standing in the golden light of a California afternoon, staring at the blue front door he had painted himself during his last leave, James questioned the wisdom of that decision. Before he could reconsider, the door opened, and Emma burst out, backpack bouncing against her small frame as she raced toward the waiting school bus. She stopped mid-stride when she saw him, her eyes widening in disbelief before joy transformed her face. "Daddy," she screamed, abandoning her backpack on the lawn and launching herself into his arms. James caught her, breathing in the sweet scent of her strawberry shampoo, feeling the solid reality of her small body against his chest. Whatever else had changed, this love remained constant. "You're not supposed to be home yet," Emma exclaimed, pulling back to examine his face as if confirming he was real. "Is it a surprise for Mum? She's been so sad lately." James managed a smile, carefully setting his daughter down. "Something like that, sweetheart, but you can't miss your bus." "But you just got here," Emma protested. "And I'll be here when you get home," James promised, retrieving her backpack. "We'll have all afternoon together, maybe get ice cream." The bribe worked. Emma gave him one more fierce hug before racing to catch the bus that had just pulled up to their stop. As the bus pulled away, James turned back to the house to find Sarah standing in the doorway, her face pale with shock. "James," she said, her voice barely audible from across the yard, "what are you doing here?" He crossed the distance between them in measured steps, each one feeling like a march into battle. Sarah stepped back into the house, allowing him to enter, her movements stiff with apprehension. The familiar scent of home lemon cleaner, the lavender candles Sarah loved, a hint of the coffee she must have had that morning hit him with unexpected force. This place that had existed in his dreams for months now seemed simultaneously familiar and foreign. "Why didn't you tell me you were coming?" Sarah asked, her arms wrapped protectively around herself. James set his duffel bag down carefully. Would it have mattered? Would you have had time to clean up any evidence? Send your latest boyfriend away? Sarah flinched as if he had struck her. "James, Don't." He held up a hand, surprised by how steady it was, when everything inside him was trembling with rage and grief. "I've seen the photos, Sarah. I've read the letter. I know what you've been doing while I've been gone." Tears filled her eyes, but James found he had no sympathy left. How many times had he comforted her through video calls when she cried about how much she missed him? How many of those tears had been real? "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered. A harsh laugh escaped him. "That might be the only honest thing you've said to me in years." "That's not fair." A flash of anger crossed her face. "You have no idea what it's been like here." "Then tell me," James challenged, his voice rising despite his best efforts to control it. "Tell me exactly what was so unbearable that you had to invite men into our bed while I was dodging bullets and watching friends die." Sarah sank onto the couch, tears flowing freely now. "It wasn't about sex," she said. "But not really. It was about feeling seen, James. Do you have any idea what it's like to be a ghost in your own life? To be known only as Captain Mitchell's wife or Emma's mum? To sleep alone for months, years at a time, while life goes on around you?" "So this is my fault," James demanded, "because I served my country, because I provided for our family the best way I knew how." No, Sarah looked up at him, her expression pleading. "It's my fault, my weakness, my failure. But James, our marriage was broken long before I cheated." The words hit him like physical blows. He thought of the shortened calls, the vague letters, the growing distance he had attributed to the normal strain of deployment. Had he been so focused on the mission that he had missed the collapse of his own marriage? "How many?" he asked, his voice hollow. Sarah closed her eyes briefly. 4. Over the last 2 years. In our home, where Emma could have seen. Only once, Sarah admitted. "Last month, Emma was at a sleepover. It was a mistake. All of it was a horrible, unforgivable mistake." James walked to the mantel, picking up their wedding photo. They had been so young, so certain of the future they would build together. Where had those two people gone? "Do you love me anymore?" he asked, his back still turned to her. The silence that followed was answer enough. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. "I love who we were. I love the father of my child. But James, I don't know if I love the man you've become, or if you could love the woman I am now. We're strangers who share memories. James set the photo down and turned to face her. What do you want, Sarah? I want to stop hurting, she said simply. I want Emma to be okay. I want to find out if there's anything left to save, or if we need the courage to let go. Outside, the sun continued to shine on their perfectly normal suburban street. Inside, two people who had once promised forever stood in the wreckage of broken vows, facing the hardest mission of their lives, finding truth in the aftermath of betrayal. James spent the night in the guest room, staring at the ceiling as memories and questions chased each other through his mind. Down the hall, he could hear Sarah's muffled sobs through the wall, a sound that once would have drawn him immediately to her side, but now only deepened his confusion. The next morning, Emma's delight at finding her father at the breakfast table temporarily pushed the tension aside. James made pancakes a deployment homecoming tradition, while Sarah packed Emma's lunch in silence. "Can you pick me up from school today?" Daddy, Emma asked, maple syrup dripping from her chin. "I want to show you my art project. It won Mrs. Benson's gold star." "Wouldn't miss it for the world," Pumpkin James promised, his heart aching at the simple joy his presence brought her. After Emma left for school, the silence between James and Sarah grew oppressive. "I have a therapy appointment at 10, Sarah finally said, clearing the breakfast dishes. "I've been going for the past month," since she trailed off. "Since you realized someone might tell me about your affairs," James couldn't keep the bitterness from his voice. Sarah's hand stilled. "Since I realized I couldn't live with myself anymore," she corrected quietly. "You can come, if you want. Dr. Brennan has been helping me understand why I made the choices I did. It might help you too." James's first instinct was to refuse. What could a civilian therapist possibly understand about their situation? But the soldier in him recognized a strategic advantage: intelligence gathering, a chance to understand the enemy. Except Sarah wasn't the enemy, no matter how betrayed he felt. "Fine," he agreed. "I'll come." Dr. Brennan's office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, its interior warm with natural light and comfortable furniture that seemed designed to put anxious minds at ease. The therapist herself was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a direct manner that James appreciated immediately. "Captain Mitchell," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "I'm glad you came. Sarah has been doing important work here, and your presence today speaks to your courage." James nodded stiffly, taking a seat across from Sarah rather than beside her on the couch. "Before we begin," Dr. Brennan continued, "I want to acknowledge the pain you both are carrying into this room. James, you've suffered a profound betrayal. Sarah, you've been confronting difficult truths about yourself. There are no villains here, only two people who have lost their way." "But with all due respect," James said, "I didn't lose my way. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, serving my country, supporting my family." Dr. Brennan nodded. "Physically, yes. But emotionally? Sarah, would you share what you've been working on in our sessions?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I've been trying to understand why I sought comfort outside our marriage," she began. "At first I blamed the loneliness, the endless deployments, the pressure of raising Emma alone. But that's not the whole truth." She looked directly at James for the first time that day. "The truth is, I felt abandoned long before I ever cheated. Not physically, I knew where you were, but emotionally you left years ago." James started to protest, but Dr. Brennan raised a hand. "Let her finish, please." "After your second tour in Afghanistan," Sarah continued, "something changed. You stopped sharing your experiences with me. When you came home, you were physically present, but mentally somewhere else. I tried to reach you, James. For years I tried, but you built walls I couldn't climb." "I was protecting you," James argued. "You don't need to know what happens over there." "But I needed to know what was happening in here," Sarah said, pointing to his heart. "I needed my husband, not just his body going through the motions of marriage during leaves." Dr. Brennan leaned forward. "James, many military personnel develop a habit of compartmentalizing, keeping their combat experiences separate from their home life. It's a survival mechanism, but it can create profound disconnection." James felt a flicker of recognition. Hadn't his commanding officer warned the unit about this very thing during pre-deployment briefings? "Leave the war on the battlefield," Colonel Ramirez had advised. "Don't bring it home, but don't shut your family out either." Hardest balancing act in the service. "That doesn't excuse what she did," James said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "No, it doesn't," Dr. Brennan agreed. "Sarah has been working hard to take full responsibility for her choices, but understanding the context of those choices is important for both of you, regardless of whether you decide to rebuild your marriage or end it." The session continued for another hour, painful truths emerging from both sides. James acknowledged how he had retreated into himself after losing 3 men in an ambush during his second tour. Sarah described the gradual erosion of intimacy, not just physical, but emotional, that had left her feeling like a single parent even when James was home. As they left the therapist's office, a fragile truce had formed between them, not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "I need to pick up Emma," James said, checking his watch. Sarah nodded. "I have a shift at the hospital. I've been picking up extra hours," till she stopped, realizing how it sounded. Not for that. To keep busy. To try to focus on something besides what I'd done. An awkward silence fell between them. Sarah finally said, "I know you probably hate me right now. I hate myself most days. But whatever happens with us, please know that Emma adores you. Don't let my mistakes cost her her father." Something in her words, the absence of excuses, the simple acknowledgement of his importance to their daughter, touched a place in James that anger had been protecting. "I would never abandon Emma," he said. "Whatever else has broken between us, that never will." As they parted ways in the parking lot, James felt a strange sense of clarity emerging from the chaos of the past 48 hours. The path forward was far from clear, but for the first time since opening that devastating email, he felt capable of taking the next step, whatever that might be. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of therapy sessions, awkward family dinners, and long walks where James tried to make sense of his shattered world. He extended his emergency leave, using accumulated vacation time that his commander had been nagging him to take for years. Emma thrived having her father home, showering him with artwork and stories, demanding piggyback rides and bedtime tales that stretched well past her usual lights-out time. In her presence, James found moments of uncomplicated joy that served as anchors in the storm. Sarah worked her hospital shifts and continued her therapy, giving James space while making herself available whenever he wanted to talk. The house developed an unspoken geography-neutral territories in the kitchen and living room, separate retreats in bedroom and home office, cautious borders that both respected. On a Sunday afternoon, while Sarah was at the hospital and Emma was at a friend's birthday party, James found himself alone in the house for the first time since his return. Restless energy drove him to the garage, where a half-finished bookshelf had been waiting for his attention for over a year. As he sanded the rough edges of oak boards, his mind drifted to a memory from basic training. His drill sergeant, a weathered man with eyes that had seen too much, had gathered the recruits after a particularly grueling day. "The hardest thing you'll ever do in uniform," the sergeant had told them, "isn't fighting the enemy, it's coming home. Combat has clear objectives: complete the mission, protect your buddies, stay alive. But home is complex. Home changes while you're gone. And so do you." James had thought it was just another motivational speech at the time. Now, with sawdust coating his hands and marriage vows hanging by threads, he recognized the profound truth in those words. He had changed. Sarah had changed. The only constant had been their mutual decision to pretend otherwise, he by retreating into silent stoicism, she by seeking connection elsewhere. The sound of the front door opening pulled James from his thoughts. Sarah appeared in the garage doorway, still in her scrubs, her face drawn with fatigue. "You're home early," James observed, setting down his sandpaper. "Traded shifts with Lisa," she explained. I thought maybe we could talk. Really talk, just the two of us." James nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "Let me clean up." They met in the backyard, neutral territory, sitting on the patio furniture they had picked out together during his leave 3 years ago. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn where Emma's bicycle lay abandoned from her last ride. "I've been thinking about what Dr. Brennan said," Sarah began. "About how we both contributed to the distance between us." James tensed, prepared for another round of justifications. "But that's not why I wanted to talk," she continued, surprising him. "I wanted to tell you that regardless of our problems, what I did was wrong. Completely wrong. And I'm sorry not just for the affairs, but for breaking the trust that was the foundation of everything we built together." The simple, unqualified apology caught James off guard. For weeks, their discussions had been tangled in context and contributing factors. This straightforward acknowledgement of wrongdoing felt like the first honest moment since his return. I appreciate that he said carefully, "I've been doing some thinking too, about how I checked out emotionally after that ambush in Kandahar, about how I convinced myself I was protecting you by not sharing the hard stuff, when really I was just protecting myself from having to process it." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "We both failed each other, didn't we?" In different ways, James agreed. "The question is, where do we go from here?" Sarah looked out at the yard, at the home they had created together. "That depends on whether you think you could ever trust me again. I wouldn't blame you if the answer is no." James had asked himself the same question countless times in recent weeks. Trust, once broken, was like a shattered mirror. It could be pieced back together, but the cracks would always be visible if you looked closely enough. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know that I'm not ready to give up on us yet. Not without trying. Emma deserves that much. Maybe we do too." "What are you saying?" Sarah asked, hope and fear mingling in her voice. "I'm saying I want to try counseling, real marriage counseling, not just crisis management. I'm saying I'm requesting a transfer to the training division at Fort Irwin. Less deployment, more stability." Sarah's eyes widened. "You'd do that? Change your whole career trajectory?" "My career has cost us enough already," James said, "and I'm not getting any younger. Training the next generation of soldiers matters too." "What about?" Sarah hesitated. "What about us, as a couple?" James reached across the table and, for the first time since his return, took her hand. It felt both familiar and strange, like returning to a hometown after many years away. "That part one don't know yet," he said honestly. "I'm still angry. I still hurt when I think about you with other men. But underneath all that, there's still something there. 17 years of history. A daughter we both adore. Maybe something worth fighting for." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. "I don't deserve this chance." Maybe not, James agreed. But marriage isn't about what we deserve. It's about what we're willing to work for. And I've never been one to walk away from a fight. As the sun set over their backyard, casting golden light on two people finding their way back from the brink, James thought about service to country, to family, to the promises made in better times that were tested in worse ones. He didn't know if they would make it. Trust, once shattered, required more than good intentions to rebuild. But sitting there, holding the hand of the woman who had broken his heart, but who had also given him his greatest joy, James Mitchell made a new kind of commitment, not blind faith this time, but eyes wide open determination to find out what could be salvaged from the wreckage of what had been. 6 months later, James stood at attention as Colonel Ramirez pinned the Meritorious Service Medal to his chest. His transfer to Fort Irwin had been approved, and this ceremony marked the official end of his combat deployment career. "Captain Mitchell has served this country with distinction for 15 years," the colonel announced to the gathered soldiers and families. "His leadership in some of our most challenging operations has saved countless lives. Fort Irwin is gaining one hell of a training officer." In the front row, Emma beamed with pride, bouncing slightly in her seat despite Sarah's gentle hand on her shoulder reminding her to stay still. They both wore new dresses for the occasion, a small detail that hadn't escaped James's notice. After the ceremony, as they walked to the car under the bright California sun, Emma skipped ahead, proudly clutching the program with her father's name printed inside. "You okay?" Sarah asked, watching him adjust to the weight of civilian clothes after years in uniform. "Getting there," James answered honestly. Their marriage counseling continued weekly. Some sessions ended in tears, others in cautious hope. Trust was rebuilding slowly, brick by careful brick. Sarah had changed hospitals, cutting ties with her past. James had started sharing more of his combat experiences, finding that speaking the nightmares aloud diminished their power. They weren't back to where they had been before that place no longer existed. Instead, they were building something new on a foundation of painful honesty and deliberate choice. As they reached the car, Emma called out, "Can we get ice cream to celebrate?"